Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a nice lunch and you're ready for the afternoon's proceedings. My name is Madeline Cordes. I'm a client director in Prism COSEC, part of the EQ advisory team. And I've been delighted to be invited to put together a panel to discuss this topic that we're now going to have a discussion about. So it's managing risk and ESG in a downturn, particularly focusing on effective communication with existing investors and attracting new investors. So I've been a company secretary for over 30 years now, I think, both in-house in FTSE 350 companies and in professional services. And in case some of you don't already know me, so I'd be delighted to join EQ in January of this year. I'd like each of the panellists to say who they are. That would be brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Mark Robinson, Head of Strategic Accounts at RDIR, which is part of Quinty's advisory area, and I'll be talking around the Attract Investors part today.
Wonderful. And I'm Adam Green. I'm the Group Chief Risk Officer for Quinty.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Walmsley. I'm one of the partners at Downturn Global Advisors. We're a strategic advisory firm based in London and the US.
And I'm Jenny Fulton, Chief Growth Officer at Emperor Corporate Communications.
And Roger Lewis, Head of Responsible Investing at Downing. We're a boutique asset manager based in London.
Thank you, everyone. So whilst I obviously love all my panellists, I'm particularly delighted to have a couple of panellists who typically, as many of you are company secretaries in the room, that we don't necessarily hear from. One is the investor, that rare breed of investor to be on a panel. So, do ask questions of Roger, and I'm sure he's going to share some insights into what investors are really looking for in terms of communication. And also Jennifer, whilst it's Jenny and Jennifer.
Really
so this is Jenny and Jennifer. Jennifer is her Dentons act for one of our clients, one of our registration and COSEC clients, on the PR side. And in my experience over all these years, it's very rare that we have a public relations advisor on a panel. So it's going to be great to hear her perspective in communicating with investors. That's great. So just to start off let me just check what we've got here on the slides. I think it's just a picture so that you won't be able to identify people as they're chatting. I just wanted to set the scene, really. So risk and ESG, in particular ESG, as company secretaries, we touch ESG, daily, whether it's helping manage the disclosure committee, managing investor meetings and questions, producing the annual report and accounts, project managing that, perhaps supporting a new ESG committee, which some companies, some in the room, I'm sure will have given it that focus by introducing a new committee specifically on ESG. But thinking about the Equinity video that I saw earlier and that we all watched, it's so important that ESG becomes part of the business, not as an add-on, which I think over the last few years it's very much been seen as, let's do an ESG report over here. And it has been seen as an add-on. So I'm sure my panellists will have views on that as to how to integrate it in both reporting and communicating. To me, ESG as a company secretary can be quite confusing and a bit of an explosion. I was talking to a colleague about it earlier in the week. Explosion around your head. So many sort of thoughts and things in both in politics and in the bigger, sort of the marketplace about greenwashing, green hushing, regulators wanting better reporting, more integrated reporting, and it's quite hard for us as company secretaries and advisors to our boards to navigate that and to see, where we can really advise and support our boards. So in the next, 40 minutes or so, we're going to just try and give you some tips and some good practice we've seen and some things perhaps to avoid that will hopefully lead to you taking away some useful insights and things that you can say, actually, yes, when I think about how we do things in our company, these might be a few takeaways that you think you could introduce or give you food for thought, really. So first of all, I'm going to talk about emerging risks. In the downturn, we've had cost of living crisis, utility hikes, which have affected consumer spending, which obviously affects many of the companies in the room. We've had COVID, we've got wars of all kinds, haven't we? So there are various emerging risks that have emerged. And I want to first of all ask the panel, when should we communicate about these emerging risks? I'm going to ask in particular Jennifer to take the lead on this at first. When should we raise some of these issues, and do we need to know all the answers as to what we're going to do with them? And how much should we say about it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And as you said, we are in sort of a very volatile environment where so various geopolitical risks, I suppose, are emerging. Also, ESG itself is evolving very rapidly. So we're seeing sort of, new risks kind of coming through all the time. We would always say communicate early, even if you don't have all the answers, because, if you're at least raising the issue, talking about it, making it clear that this is something that you're discussing internally, then that's much better than saying nothing at all. Because if you say nothing at all, then the external narrative will be, they're not even aware that this is an issue, they're not thinking about it, and that will then sort of, start to develop without you. So they will, if there's an issue emerging and your company does have sort of a, an impact, or that has an impact on your company, then start to talk about it early, even if you don't have all the answers yet.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. So, Adam, you, when we were doing a briefing for this session, said ESG could be a risk in itself. So, and you were concerned about the scope of disclosure, the breadth of disclosure. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the premise of the session is you've got risk and ESG is a term that everyone in this room is familiar with. Outside of the, immediate circles of, kind of companies and professional services, it's not a very well understood term, but even with inside companies and different professional services, it means very different things. So there is a bit of a challenge with making sure that everyone knows which part of it they're speaking about and exactly what aspects of it they believe are could produce risks. But ESG itself has been creating new obligations. So if we go back a few years, there were a number of areas which people would used to pay regard to or would find important for the companies, but they weren't areas which would ordinarily come to the top of the risk agenda or be something which would be talked about board level or be a disclosure risk. In the last sort of 5 years in particular, the requirements or the environment around ESG has created a number of new categories of potential disclosure or potential risk to manage. And so if you are engaging in ESG, if you set yourself out, as we said about with greenwashing, that ESG is a fundamental part of your company, you now also need to meet those standards as well. So ESG presents a number of new areas to talk about, but also raises the challenge of actually meeting the standards you've set for yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And Roger, do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, I like what Adam just said about it varies who's the message for, who's the risk you're communicating. When you speak to investors, really you've got two audiences. You've got the fund managers, the investment teams. These are the people that have made a conscious decision to invest in your companies. Then you've got the green people, the sustainability people like me. And it's really, what's the message? What's the risk you're communicating? If it's a financial risk, well, let's say you're cutting your dividend or you're issuing a profit warning, then of course the fund managers are going to want to know about that straight away. I think, Jennifer, you made that point. What we're seeing increasingly is sustainability impacts financial risk more and more. So again, you issued a profit warning. Why is that? Have you had to pay a fine because you've caused environmental damage? Or do you have a weak management team or an ineffective board not providing oversight? So you can see ESG is impacting financials there. But I think either way, like the panelists said, we'd want to know straight away. There's no point waiting. I think the message is going to come out eventually. And also important is what are you going to do about it to mitigate the risk? I'll give you an example quickly. We hold a French outsourcing company. In November last year, they had a big labour rights scandal. Basically, they were spying on their staff and coercing them into forced overtime. So when that news broke, there was massive outrage, a big ESG controversy. The share price crashed. We actually invested at that point because the very next day, the CEO and the CFO both came out with an apology and a public statement on what they're going to do to mitigate that risk. It was credible. They had plans around working groups and policies around that. And since then, the market's forgiven them. So the share price is back up. The ESG controversy has improved as well. So I think that's a good example of communicate the risk straight away. And it doesn't matter if it's financial. You can probably link it to sustainability as well. And I think that's what investors want to see.
Yeah, so it really seems to talk to honesty and transparency. And as I think you said, Jennifer, you don't have to know all the answers, but you need to have a sort of a route forward that gives your investors confidence by the sound of it. I was thinking as well that investor relations, many of you in the room will work with the investor relations team. Maybe there are some people from the investor relations team here, but I think mainly we're company secretaries. They're not in the boardroom, are they? So when things are being discussed, we are absolutely at the coalface to be able to, hear that little flag, or this is happening, this is worrying the board. At what point should we be talking about it outside? Whether it might be a listing rules, disclosure, very concrete, obvious one that we need to communicate. But as Roger said, sometimes it's very grey area, and Jennifer, that we can help advise and influence the board as to the right timing and maybe getting other advisors involved to consult with. So moving on from that particular topic, Jenny, I wanted to ask you, how can we use the different mediums to communicate, for instance, the annual report and the website, to communicate where perhaps something isn't an immediate announcement requirement, but a longer term emerging risk?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we've watched a real shift in the way that risk is reported on within the annual report, from very much boilerplate disclosures to much more bespoke reporting, and companies talking about how their whole risk management is evolving and maturing. So we actually did a whole analysis of annual reporting across the FTSE 350 earlier in the year, and it's really interesting. So 73% now give meaningful detail on how they're monitoring and identifying emerging risk. And one of the big areas is obviously climate change. That's a biggie. And 55% then include real detail on the financial impact of climate-related risks and opportunities. So we're just seeing greater disclosure across the board on emerging risks, horizon scanning. So Fresnillo, for example, they included like a table that mapped out timeframes around emerging risks and when they expected to see them really translate into a threat. And then I think also what's changed is there's much more context given. So companies using the market overview, for example, to just talk about what's happening in the market, and sort of give that context that then can be signposted to the risk section. And then I think the final thing we're seeing is just more discussion about risk culture, and how that is being embedded within the organisation, which is really important, I think, to talk about when you're thinking about these emerging risks coming through. And so IHG actually included coverage about that in their people section of their annual report, and then they also talk about risk owners for some of these key risks that's coming through. So I think just more context, greater disclosure, and really connected thinking that is using a bit of that storytelling piece. This is the context, this is what's happening, and then what are we doing about it? How are we evolving and changing?
Yeah, and I think the company secretary can have a really good role in that. This boilerplate thing, we've been talking about it for years, haven't we? But we are really seeing it disappear now. I've noticed that in the last few years. I think because the market's demanding, that transparency, and he's prepared to listen when you don't have all the answers, but you have a suggested journey that the company is going to go on, and how are you going to deal with this emerging risks? Because it seems to be a lot more honesty.
Yeah.
And so that makes it easier for me, I think, as a company secretary, to actually suggest some drafting from the conversations you're having in the boardroom, where perhaps you're working with the chairman of the audit committee or the risk committee or sustainability committee, and you can suggest some wording that actually does really reflect what you're doing, rather than, a boilerplate, as you say, or going from last year and just updating it. So that's really helpful. And did you also do some resilience research, or was this part of?
Yeah, it was all part of the same thing. And I think that's been really interesting, because what we've seen is more and more companies sort of framing the whole main narrative around their annual report around the subject of resilience and the sort of long-term growth. So 24% of the reports we looked at that really was a central theme, and we're actually expecting that to increase this year. So, and I think what we saw there is companies doing it well, really setting the tone from the top. A lot more Q&As from fireside chat style, talking on the whole issue of resilience, and really covering both the short term and the long term. So, in the short term, the narrative around agility and examples of really good decision making, kind of navigating through challenging times and providing proof points around that. But then I think it's also really interesting in the long term, just a clearly defined vision or ambition statement that sort of is a really powerful tool to showcase long-term thinking. And 41% of the reports we looked at had that in the report. And again, coming back to market dynamics, setting that context, what are the trends, thinking about the long term. And so 3/4 of the report discussed both the challenges and the opportunities. But the best reporters then went on and talk about, okay, how are we evolving our business model? How's our strategy changing as a result of this? So some really great examples out there of just connected thinking.
And forward thinking as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
By the sound of it. Yeah, that's good. And Jennifer, if risks evolve very quickly, which they are in this sort of current climate, how are companies able to keep up to speed, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important and, encouraging to hear how much honesty is coming through in the reporting across the FTSE. I think it's really important that sort of risk and risk management isn't a static process. I think you used to see companies basically cutting and pasting from the annual report, 1 year to the next, which, I think is sort of happening a lot less. And certainly we've seen that as well. You also do see companies that are, when they talk about risk, when they have their risk committees, they're just looking at the group of risks that they've already identified. And I think it's really important to make sure that there's room throughout the year somewhere for some of that blue sky thinking, where companies really think about, okay, what's on the horizon. When we talk to companies about ESG, we're often talking about three sets of risks predominantly. One is sort of evolving regulatory risk. And, as we know, that's an area that's kind of evolving very, very quickly. So important to be aware of that. We talk about the sort of risk of something changing in terms of your access to capital, because investors are constantly changing their expectations that are constantly being ramped up. And then we talk about sort of reputational risk. So, what are the risks to your reputation from how the ESG agenda is evolving? And then I think around all of that, it's just really important to get those external perspectives. I think there's often a tendency to be a bit sort of insular and a bit sort of navel gazing. And often when we go in and talk to companies about how they should be communicating externally, there's a real sort of lack of external perspectives being sort of considered inside the company itself, whether that's in the executive team or the board more generally. So I think just really important to be aware of, who are your key stakeholders, what are they saying about you and about the issues that matter to you, and then making sure that you're really doing that kind of blue sky thinking in terms of how you think about, the issues that are coming down the line and that might affect you.
Yeah, that's really useful, Jennifer. And it's made me think of two things. One is that the Sustainability Committee, which I think you were saying, Adam, is probably more sort of outward looking than the Risk Committee. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes. So I think one of the pieces that's becoming more apparent over the last few years is the need to have clear, focused groups. Now, whether or not you create a separate committee or how you arrange the governance, what is I think important is that you have dedicated time for board members and therefore for the executives feeding into them, because many of these issues require a body of knowledge, so they require some training and focus. There's also specific questions to work through, so you need to dedicate some time. And then also there's ownership and accountability. So depending on how you want to organise the governance, I think what's becoming very clear though is if you don't have the structure and the time allocated, you're not going to get consistent coverage.
Yeah, that definitely. And the other thing that I've noticed from my own sort of, working with clients is this sort of the review of the risk register is done sort of discreetly to the board, sort of talking about strategy, and certain risks emerging in the board discussions, but the risk register isn't necessarily connected with that. So I think there's a lot of work as company secretaries we could do to help boards see that, it's important to connect those two, and actually to not say, let's do a 6-month review of the risk register separate to the emerging risks that are coming out every day. So I think it's a good time to bring Roger in here again and to talk about ESG ratings, and if Jennifer's got any comment on it. This is one of those confusing things, isn't it, that we as company secretaries receive various things about ESG ratings and questionnaires to fill in and all sorts, but could you give a bit more flavour and colour to those ratings as an investor?
Yeah, I was just thinking there's a few wild wests for ESG. Carbon offsets is one. ESG ratings is another one.
Yep.
I think they do have a role to play. I don't think they're as important as some companies think they might be. What you'll find, I think, if you have more progressive and sophisticated investors, they'll use the ratings as a start point only, and then they'll supplement that with their own research, their own analysis. So we've got a hybrid approach, for example. So we do buy data and scores, but then we've got scorecards and tools and our own research. We look at your annual reports, your sustainability reports, your policies. We can speak to you as well. And we're going to talk about communication shortly. We're going to have engagement discussions. Yeah. And all that informs our view on whether to invest or divest or to engage and how we vote as well. I get it, there's frustrations around the sector. I think with that in mind, don't obsess about your score. So for someone like MSCI or Sustainalytics, they say you're a C for ESG, fine. They can offer, there's massive conflict because they can offer consulting services as well. So pay us $100,000 and we'll improve your score from a C to an A, which is a massive conflict. They're also for COSECs as well. I know you can get unreasonable requests. Maybe some guy in Bangalore will send you a list, send me these 20 metrics within 24 hours, or else we're going to downgrade your ESG score. So I think keep all that in mind. I think rating agencies deserve some of your attention. When you see how your sophisticated investors use the data, it's not the most important metric in the world. So give it some, but not all of your attention. I think that's the best way to approach rating agencies.
Thank you, Roger. Mark, you've been a bit quiet over there. So Mark is within our IDIR team working in investor relations. So moving on to sort of general communication thoughts, what do you see as sort of effective communication and a communication plan? I know you've talked to me about that. How's that important to companies?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I think the main thing you need to consider about your communication is who are you speaking to. So it's not just about servicing your current investors. It's thinking about who could be the investor for the future. Not every investor is a Vanguard who's going to buy and hold forever, or so they'll say. You need to understand who's going to be picking up the slack, who's going to be buying when somebody's selling shares in your company, and how's the market actually changing. So working closely with your investor relations teams to understand the importance of that annual report. That is the first document that a new investor is going to be looking at. And that's the point of truth in the status of your company, and those historical views on your annual reports to really establish a trend in the competency of the company, the truth. How much does everything match up from what do you say is going to be happening with the business and what does happen with the business. And then working with the investor relations team, these are the people who are marketing your equity. They're going out to reach new investors. Not only do you have this annual report, but working together, what are the key highlights, around ESG, around your financials for a nice one-pager that then you can use things like, email distribution channels. If you're a FTSE 100 company, you could have 5,000-6,000 contacts on a distribution. It's a targeted approach to potentially interested investors, and maintaining that constant level of communications, being consistent with the message. Those are the really important things.
Whilst I'm not doing a sales pitch, you do have a sort of tool that helps companies
Thank you, Madam.
create that platform.
Yes, we do.
You didn't pay me for this.
So, working with, external providers such as RDIR, we can help you to build out these distribution lists, find these targeted investors for you to make sure that every potential buyer of the stock is getting a contact point. It's a really good process where very few people actually will unsubscribe, because there's a rationale for sending your information out to these potential new investors. And like I say, the consistency of that approach, backing up not only sending out your regulatory news announcements. Investors aren't signed up to 350 RNSs, different stocks coming out. But if you think that somebody is appropriate to be sending out your results, send out those results via a second channel as well, a third channel. I know Jenny's probably more into the social media side than myself. I'm a bit of a Luddite in that world, but these other channels you can use as well. Just get that really broad reach of your message and the consistency of it, targeted audience, and you maintain the liquidity in your stock and the interest as well.
Definitely. So on general communication generally, Roger, what do you see as effective communication for you as an investor? I know you talked to me about sort of it being two-way, because it isn't always, is it?
Yeah, this is coming into engagement now and stewardship, which is massive for ESG investors. Integrate material sustainability factors into your investment decisions. That's the first key pillar. And the second one is be an active and engaged owner. Have a dialogue with your investee companies. That's almost, I think we think about what's the outcome here. To start with the end in mind, what do we want to achieve through communication with yourselves? If we want to get to an outcome that we're both happy with, that's why we do engagement. We have two guiding principles, the way we approach all communications with investees. First is collaboration and partnership. Think about the outcomes we're trying to get to. We want to achieve net environmental gain, positive societal outcomes, or well-governed companies. That's what ESG is. So of course, we should be having a dialogue actively about this. We've got a fiduciary duty to our clients. So we owe our clients. They give us money to invest. So we owe them a duty of loyalty and a duty of care. So as part of that duty, we should be speaking to yourselves as well. That's the first guiding principle. The second is we recognize it's companies' own decisions as well. Your boards, your management teams, you'll make the decisions. Our role as investors is to set the context. So why are we asking for particular changes? What does the market expect? What are your peers doing? Decarbonisation is a really good example. If we think about the internet revolution, what was that, 25 years ago? It changed the world. And now the green revolution is doing the same. So we could say to you, why should you set targets to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions? Why should you have green capex or lobbying that supports the Paris Agreement on climate change, or disclosures using the TCFD framework, which also ties in with the risk register you mentioned earlier around climate risk? But ultimately, to do all that, it's the company's decision. Your boards will decide whether or not to take our advice. So that's our two guiding principles, kind of the partnership approach, but also providing the context. And then underneath that, we've got various tools we could use. For example, we can write you letters, we can have calls and meetings. I think a clear agenda for each interaction we have is important, because there's a finite resource. Who speaks to companies? It's myself as an ESG person, or it's my fund manager colleagues as well. But that could only be like an hour once a year that we speak. So we do prioritize which companies we speak to and which subjects. It can be, maybe we haven't spoken for a year. In October 2022, you said you're going to improve your diversity at board and senior management level within 12 months. Okay, fine, it's been a year. Let's check back in and see what your progress has been. But I think having that clear prioritization around which companies, which subjects we're going to discuss. And then finally, for effective communication, it's just behaviors that we both can expect. Obviously, it's a professional, collaborative type conversation. It shouldn't be adversarial. This is the difference between activists and active owners. We're very much active owners. I'm not sure if there's any IR people here, but if they are, don't ignore us either. We've got a Spanish utility we hold, which has been ignoring us. We want to talk to them about decarbonisation. Power utilities are a massive source of greenhouse gas emissions alongside transport and agriculture. That's the three biggest sectors. They're not engaging with us. They're completely ignoring us. So therefore, we're going to AGM. We're going to put a resolution at their AGM to demand decarbonisation at their AGM in May next year, rather than just having a dialogue about it, which would have been our preference. So there's a few thoughts. You
become activists because of their neglect of you as an investor?
Unfortunately, yes. Whereas if they'd listened, they'd have seen our principles and our behaviours and our tools.
I mean, I think that goes to having this ongoing programme, as Mark was saying, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And I know with some of the smaller PLCs, you may have, COSEC stroke investor relations role, and you touch shareholders at different points, as well as the investor relations team. So I know from, when I think of my own clients in the past or current clients, there isn't always that regular sort of planning ahead for communications. There isn't really necessarily a proper communication program. It's more those that rock up and complain and, have the loudest voice that the board go, oh, we better speak to Joe Bloggs because they're concerned about that. But having a more structured approach with a structured agenda for the meetings it's sort of common sense, but it doesn't always get done because there's not the planning time or it's not prioritised. So Jenny, bringing you in again, I was just thinking about there's so many different channels of communication, aren't there? Which, again, the COSEC or IR teams would get involved in, is the website particularly and social media channels. How can companies sort of get the best use out of those, do you feel?
I think starting with the website, it's still the most trusted source of information. And so keeping the website relevant and up to date is just super important. It's amazing how often we'll see companies spending loads of time on the annual report, all the information's in there, but the rest of the website isn't consistent and isn't updated and it's not relevant. And so for starters, I think thinking across your channels, thinking about the network, if you like, of communications. So your reporting, sustainability report, the website, but then also how you can take advantage of social media as well. And I think the opportunity there to really reiterate and show progress and also use different mediums, video, animation. How can you really bring information to life and make it engaging and engage your audiences with it? And I think one of the challenges that you have is, as much as we're talking about investor communications at the moment, all those communications that you put out, you have a range of other audiences that are interested in them. I think that can be a challenge sometimes with the annual report, that actually you've got employees, future talent, customers all looking at that. And so I think there are also just principles around just keeping your communications really clear, consistent, connected, and then compelling, I'd say, is the final bit of the piece on that.
Yeah, I think in the earlier session we had share plans and the app. It's all about making the information readily available, isn't it? And short sound bites from an actual real person. You can get a feel for their personality of that particular company, can't you? And
Absolutely.
The employees or the future employee would either buy into that or not, as the sort of style or behaviours or the culture of the company will come across.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess I'd add to that as well. I think those short kind of sound bites, there's some brilliant stuff that you can do just to create assets that you can keep using on social media. And so often when at the moment you're probably starting that painful process of putting the annual report together and gathering all the content, the wasted opportunity sometimes is all that when it just stays there in the annual report, whereas then actually planning for the year, actually how are we going to reinforce, how are we going to talk about how we're embedding sustainability within the organisation and use some of the case studies and the proof points that you talk about in the annual report and keep reiterating the message. Really important. Such an opportunity on social media to do that.
That sounds like great advice.
Just add to the point, which is the level of information. I mean, as an investor, you must see this. The level of information that's now coming through with all of these different channels means that the amount of attention and understanding has collapsed. Yeah. So if you want to get one message out, you have to act like an advertising agency now, where you have to take your one message and just repeat and repeat and repeat, because otherwise there isn't enough time for people to digest it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's such a sort of noise going on around ESG, like we were saying right at the beginning, isn't there? And I think I read somewhere that I'm not a communications expert, you guys are, but someone needs to see, you need to do it 7 times, and then hopefully that someone will see it. As you say. Yeah, exactly. Or it sort of goes in. You might see it going by on your LinkedIn feed or whatever. I was thinking about on the communication side. Let me just have a look at my brief. So you've talked about how we can use them more effectively. Do any of you have sort of views about working more closely with IR? I think you talked about it a little bit, Mark, but have you got sort of any examples I can give some myself? But
yeah, I mean,
with COSEC as well.
It's about, like just going back to my earlier point about understanding the message and understanding the changing nature of your audiences. I mean, if I sort of use an example, working closely with a FTSE 100 company just before COVID, looking at investor targeting, we've got a clear plan. This is who your target investors are over the next sort of 12, 24 months. The COVID crash happened. We've refreshed this list. We look at the underlying constituents of the portfolios. They've gone from value funds being the key targets for them over this period. And now we're looking at recovery funds. So we've got a short-term program to pick up the slack of people who are selling the shares when the market's crashing. And then who are these investor relations officers? Who are they going out to and then market the equity to? It's a different message you need to talk about then, because you've got macro effects hitting your company's performance. So it's really being diligent and being nimble with your data. Don't think, if you talk about an investor targeting program, we don't do this once, we pin it up against the wall, these are our targets for the next 2 years. Things change. You have to be nimble with the data. You have to understand different participants want a different message as well. So tailoring and working with the investor relations team is really critical to make sure that you're aligned with that.
Yeah, I think with COSEX being more aware of this, it's perhaps slightly outside our day job, but that's why we thought this was a really good topic for COSEX, because it hopefully makes you think about the wider issues around communication and investor engagement. The last question I was going to ask my panel, and then we'll hand over to you to see if you've got any questions for us, was to Jennifer, which is, where do companies typically go wrong? I'm sure you've seen, you've all talked about some good examples and case studies of companies that, have done things well, like, the annual report, etc. But I'm sure you've also seen some that have not been so good, and it'll be useful to hear those.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the main thing was a couple of things that we see companies doing. One of them is that they try to sort of talk about everything there possibly is to talk about in ESG, absolutely everywhere, all at the same time. And in reality, no company can impact everything, or has sort of so many impacts. No company really is going to significantly have an impact on 15 sustainable development goals. But you do see lots of companies that just kind of throw them all in and try to talk about too much.
Kitchen sink sort of thing.
Kitchen sink it, exactly. So then the story just becomes really confusing. So when we work with companies, we always say to them, look, what are the key areas where you have an impact, the things that your stakeholders really care about? Maybe there's 5 areas. So you focus on those and you set really clear goals and commitments, and then you track progress towards that, and you measure that, and you report on that every year on a year-on-year consistent basis. I think the other thing that companies do sometimes tend to do is be a little bit too apologetic about ESG, and they don't get the link to value. It's really important that you don't have, here's our business strategy, oh look, here's our ESG strategy over here. The two things have to be integrated, and you have to talk about why the ESG priorities that you have, why focusing on those actually adds value to the business. We need to move away from this idea of, here are the things we do from an ESG perspective, and we think it's worth the cost of doing these things. What you should be saying is, here are the things we focus on from an ESG perspective, and this is how these things add value to our business, and therefore why we do them, and this is why it's important to the strategy. And I just think that dovetailing of strategy and ESG priorities doesn't happen anywhere near enough still.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and it's a bit scattergun approach, isn't it? Oh yes, well we do save money on light bulbs, and sort of trying to find things to say about it. Whereas if ESG is integrated, and as what you said on the Equinity video, it's we've got our business around our ES strategy, or it's integrated as part of our overall strategy. I think some companies don't look far enough ahead either, horizon scanning. So that's helpful. And the COSEC can help with that on COSEC reports. I'm sure many of you prepare COSEC and governance reports for your boards. So looking ahead as to the regulations that are coming in, the guidance that's coming in, trying to work out which are the most important. As we said, it's a bit of a mess out there. But planning ahead for those sort of things and regulatory requirements is helpful. And not saying enough, I think you've said this before, that sometimes companies either are too enthusiastic, like you said, go back, but they don't actually say enough. And when I was doing training some years ago, when we used to call it CSR, people actually, company secretaries and boards didn't realise they actually did have elements of a strategy. They just hadn't really sort of pulled it all together into a strategy. So I think that's helpful. Any thoughts from you, Adam, on any of those topics that we were talking about?
No, I think it's the theme all the way through, which is, it is now fundamentally part of that conversation at all levels. So, where you have governance reports, where you have governance forums, where you have risk frameworks, these concepts need to be baked in, and they're not one thing or another. And without having that consistency all the way through, you won't have the airtime. I think the other point as well is that evolution. So go back to framework. So the UK government has confirmed a couple of days ago, Baroness Penn, that they're going to go ahead with the enhanced disclosure requirements for carbon. there was a project underway that started a couple of years ago to create a UK standard for ESG disclosure, so an ESG taxonomy. And the idea being that the UK could lead the world in disclosure standards. That's been a really hard discussion because of the development of Europe and all the different pieces. I think what's going on, though, is that you've now got too many different ways of talking about the same topic. So for any one company, it's really important to bring it all together, create one set of consistent language, and then go back to the point on explaining and engaging. And it's got to be the same consistently, partly because of the regulatory change that seems to be coming forward for us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adam. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I think this should be a question slide. So do we have any questions from the audience for our panel? Got one at the back there. Thank you. Oh, you've got to borrow this off me, haven't you? Shoe allowance.
The anticipation's building. It's going to be a good question.
Yeah, no pressure at all now. So this one's from Mark. There are so many different kind of changing conditions, whether it's from the company's perspective about who they want to be talking to, maturity in the life of a PLC, market, and then the sort of macro trends. How really do you get down to who you should be talking to? And is there one of these factors which you'd say is more important than another, or is it a big mix of things?
I think you have to look at it as sort of a multi-scenario output when you're reviewing who your potential targets are. There are things that you control as a PLC and you understand what your message is going to be. And as you say, then there are these external factors as well. So, having an idea of where your company potentially will be in the future is key. So what metrics can you compare to, public holding information? So you're looking at systems like FactSet, who hold this public filing data, so from the 808 registers in the UK. This is a historical document of a historical investment decision. So data you're seeing in these databases, it's not necessarily reflective of what that fund manager is going to be doing in the future. It's what they're currently holding. So you have to have that caveat in mind, but then, put into different buckets. Who am I going to be? Who's a similar company today where we think we could be in the future? Who are the funds that buy when the market starts to turn? So who are going to be your macro buyers potentially? And having these multiple channels of targets so that you're always communicating and ready to communicate and understanding what message you could be sending out. That's the key thing. It's not one linear view of these are my targets, because everything changes all the time and some of it's out of your control.
Thank you, Mark. Do we have any other questions? So I'm going to end now with just a key bit of advice from Roger. So I think you had something else you wanted to share with the audience.
Yeah, it kind of follows on from that point just now about
Perfect.
The evolution from CSR in the 1990s. It was a bit of an afterthought. We've got some spare cash. Let's have a glossy brochure with our employees smiling, planting trees. And it's come a long way since then. I think for yourselves as COSEX, you should be aware of this new discipline around sustainability reporting. It is only going to go one way. Mm-hmm. Think about financial reporting, the annual report, your financial statements. They're standardized, they're trustworthy, they're comparable. You can take 2 income statements or 2 balance sheets side by side for companies in the same sector. Straight away, you can see which one's performing better. That's where we need to get to for sustainability data. And it is, therefore, new challenges for yourselves. There's new skills to learn. You may need new resources, new data. For example, carbon emissions. We've got the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. If you're familiar with that, look at Scope 3. It's really complex, really difficult. What about nature and biodiversity? The impacts are very localized. So how can you standardize impacts on, you've got a field here with its own ecosystem and a river over there with a completely different ecosystem. How do you standardize those into metrics that investors and other stakeholders can understand? So I think with that in mind, I think just being aware, developing the skills, I think, for sustainability reporting is going to be really important. And also, horizon scanning's come up a few times. There is a lot of regulatory activity around this as well. So just being aware of what regulators are saying. I think, Maddie, the example you're referencing for me now is the FCA, our regulator. They're being very active in green regulation. 2 in particular, there's an anti-greenwashing rule coming in Q4 this year, targeted for us around the claims we make. Then we'll see the DWS fine, the German asset manager, last week. $19 million fine, and it cost the CEO his job as well for greenwashing, but also for money laundering as well. So that's two big failures. But I think with that in mind, everyone's a bit edgy now, and there will be rules around greenwashing, which, while they're targeted for investors, I think they could apply to companies as well. Particularly if you make claims around being carbon neutral just by buying carbon offsets. The EU is going to outlaw that in 2026. I'm sure the UK would be similar as well. And then related, again, it's more for us, but I think it's worth yourselves being aware of, from the FCA, is the vote reporting table as well. They've just finished a consultation on this. When we vote against some resolutions, let's say we vote against your directors or we vote against your pay proposals, for some of our companies, we write to you to explain why we voted against, because it's useful feedback for you to be aware. What the FCA is proposing is for this to be a public record. So you can go to your AGM, you can see all the investors, you can see whether they vote each resolution and whether they voted for or against it. I think that'd be useful for COSEX or companies in general to be aware of, particularly if you've got votes against. And there's just two examples of horizon scanning where you need to. It's fast evolving. There's lots happening as well, which is my last piece of advice. Just be aware and kind of develop that skill around sustainability and ESG reporting.
Yeah, I think, as company secretaries, we need to really keep educating ourselves so that we can, play a part in the board and help with those sort of strategies. So to finish then, I'd like to thank my panel, which is Roger, Jenny, Jennifer, Adam and Mark, for a very interesting discussion, and thanks for your participation.